Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the beaches were copper, the pince-nez was golden, and the blaze was silver, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the difference between Holmes's pipes? Or how often he smoked cigars versus cigarettes? Or what Egyptian cigarettes are like?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 298, The British Monarchy. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I hope you're wearing your finest regal wear today.
I am. It's just sort of my normal morning habit. I generally put on the same costume every day. You know, Steve Jobs was noted for always wearing a black turtleneck and jeans and running shoes. I always put on my ermine cape, and it's hard to pick the right jewelry because you don't want to wear a heavy crown all day.
Well, that's true. Does strain the neck some. This is why a barrel coronet is worth having.
You know, I used to play the barrel cornet.
I knew that was coming.
When I was in school, and the problem is the jewels would just pop out.
Yeah.
If you hit a high C, you spend a lot of time, rummaging around on the floor trying to find the gems.
Well done, sir. Well,
and I didn't mind that, but my mother, always made a big deal about the fact that my knees needed to be brushed, and I had to get my trousers over to the dry cleaner, and that was irritating.
Minor inconveniences, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, folks, we are going to be talking about the British monarchy in this episode. It's a wonderful opportunity to reflect on British monarchs throughout the course of the Sherlock Holmes stories, particularly as we're thinking about this transition from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III, a momentous time in history. If you'd like to be a momentous impact or leave a momentous impact on our show, the best way to do that is to go to, well, certainly the show notes, ihose.co/trifles298. It'll take you directly to this episode, or directly to Patreon, patreon.com/trifles. We are now offering Trifles ad-free for all of our Patreon supporters. By way of our thanks to you, we want to make it possible for you to listen to the show uninterrupted, straight through, because I know you can never tire of listening to Bert and to me. No, we don't want that interruption in there for you. So just simply go to our Patreon link on our homepage, or just go to patreon.com/trifles. Any level of support is great. And again, not only do you get the shows ad-free, you also have an opportunity to win a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal every month as part of a drawing, and every quarter your name is automatically eligible for a drawing for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal, including the Christmas annual. There's no other way you can get the annual, so this is a great way to guarantee that it arrives at your doorstep. Well, it was a sad week last week as we learned that Queen Elizabeth II passed away at the age of 96. She represented something of constancy and consistency in the British Empire, or what is left of the empire. It's really a commonwealth now. And she reigned for 70 years, the longest reigning monarch in British history. And what's interesting to me, Bert, is this parallel between Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria, who reigned during Sherlock Holmes's time, who I think is the second longest reigning monarch, if I'm not mistaken. Again, her death in 1901 must have been just like a shockwave through the folks in England and beyond.
It's an end of an age. It's an end of an era. The Victorian era and this modern Elizabethan era. And it's a useful tag to be able to look at a great swath of history. But in the case of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, it's a couple of astonishing things, I think. One is the outpouring of sentiment and affection in the United States for Queen Elizabeth, which I think is wonderful, but also her life, her life of service, commitment, steady dedication. It's you avoid saying we shall not see her like again, because I'm sure Charles has made it very clear that he will dedicate, as he puts it, what remains of his life to the service of his people and the nation. But it was just remarkable. 15 prime ministers, 16 prime ministers that the Queen had seen and counseled and so on. Unbelievable.
It's astounding. And when you think back to the end of Victoria's reign, Winston Churchill, who was the first prime minister under or with whom Queen Elizabeth served, he was first elected to Parliament in 1900, while Victoria was still on the throne. And in terms of the Sherlockian world, you've got Christopher Morley and Edgar Smith, Basil Rathbone, Edith Miser, S.C. Roberts, Dorothy Sayers. These are all people who were born in the late Victorian era, and their lives spanned the reigns of both queens. So
interesting.
Yeah. So I thought it might be interesting for us to take an examination at the monarchs who were the British monarchs who were named or otherwise obliquely referred to in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Are you up for a little quizzical journey here?
Yes. Absolutely.
All right. Well, we already mentioned Victoria, but where do we actually get a sense of Victoria in the Sherlock Holmes stories?
A sense of Victoria.
Yes.
Interesting. Well, the Victoria is one of those historical figures who seems to be in the next room. Seems to be sort of on the outer circle of the world of Holmes and Watson. But we do know that, Holmes made a trip to Windsor and came back with a, particularly fine emerald tie pin.
That is correct. A certain gracious lady gave it to him. And that is as close as we get to as a name check to Victoria. I mean, obviously, you've got the reference to Victorian things, the Victorian portico and the blanched soldier, the Victorian whiskers of Lord Cantlemere in the Mazarin Stone, Victoria Station popping up from time to time. But of course, Victoria was ever present on the walls of Baker Street, literally on the walls of Baker Street. How in fact, is Victoria represented in Baker Street?
Well, because, and this is a very interesting aspect of the canon, particularly for those who dabble in Sherlockian scholarship, there is a point in the cases of Sherlock Holmes where Watson is grumbling a bit about the challenge of living with someone who's got the attitudes and talents and skills and habits of Sherlock Holmes. And he describes it as being somewhat outre, the fact that his flatmate would, with a hair trigger pistol and a box of cartridges, shoot the initials VR into the wall of Baker Street. But I believe, because of where we hear and when we hear about that took place quite close to Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which would have been in 1887.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. This was, of course, in the Musgrave ritual. Holmes is recounting to Watson one of his earliest cases. And I like that supposition, Bert, that it was close to the Jubilee, because, sitting around and shooting VR into the wall, it's not an everyday occurrence, really. I mean, can you imagine how the wall would have disintegrated if Holmes did this with any regularity? Yes, so that is Queen Victoria, ever present throughout the stories, and really the Sherlock Holmes picks up in the late Victorian era from 1881. The last 20 years of her reign. We have the majority of the Sherlock Holmes stories happening in that time frame.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And although the Musgrave ritual was a reminiscence of Holmes,
yes,
Watson is telling us about it when the case comes to print, and that is, a year or two after 1887 as an example. But yeah.
Yeah. How about, let's see, King George III? The Madness of King George. Do you know where King George III came into play?
King George III. Well,
I think we have all four Georges covered.
It's another.
Actually.
It's another oblique reference. It's
Yes.
it's the oblique reference in the case where Holmes observes. It's always a joy to meet an American, and he says, he's one of these people. It's a fascinating statement by Holmes about that you can interpret to mean a number of things. One is expansionism of the empire, because he basically says, it seems to me that the union of English-speaking peoples, which is a phrase that Winston Churchill used, and someday our children might be brought together, under a common flag. And that the bungling of a monarch and the problems of this prior generation, and of course that bungling monarch was George III.
Yes, I think the quote is "the folly of a monarch and the blundering of a minister in far gone years." So yeah, the folly-stricken George III would have been the reference there. So that's two monarchs on our journey. We have 11 total, believe it or not. So let's see. You want to try and stump me on the next one?
Yes. Where do we find in the history of the canon the angry monarch?
The angry monarch?
Yeah.
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 Well, we mentioned the madness of King George.
No.
Angry monarch.
Yeah. Yeah. It's in a case of identity, where, of course, we're hearing about the client's proposed marriage, and she was to be married at St. Saviour's, which was near King's Cross.
We're going to do this, are we? Okay.
Well, you asked me if I would stump you.
All right, step aside, son. Let me take over here.
And I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that.
Of course you would. Of course you would. All right. I'll tell you what. Why don't we begin at the beginning then? Well, not that we're beginning, but let's head back to the beginning. Monarch number one. Who was the first British king?
The first British king?
Yeah.
You mean mentioned in the canon, or British king anywhere?
Well, yeah, I guess the first, the oldest one mentioned in the canon, because I know Richard the Lionhearted was not mentioned, but
oh yeah,
we do go back to the age
I guess
of
it's
the
Edward.
conquest.
Isn't Edward the first before William?
That's a good. Boy, you caught me unawares.
I thought Edward. Well, Edward may have predated. I had the impression that Edward came before the Williams. But
I think you may be right.
Edward was the confessor. Edward,
no. William is first.
Oh, okay.
That's
William
what I thought.
The
Yeah,
Conqueror. Okay.
William the Conqueror. So where do we find William?
His name turns up in the cardboard box in the name of a steamship.
Yeah, the name being
Conqueror.
The Conqueror. Exactly.
Yes.
That was easy enough. That was one that nearly stumped me because he was not name checked per se, although it was one of those oblique references. And similarly, when we think about another William II, who followed the reign of his father, William I. He was King of England from 1087 until 1100. This one is another fairly oblique one. Do you know where we might find reference to William II?
He's referred to in the. I obviously didn't know this until it had surfaced in research, but he's mentioned in Valley of Fear as the Red King.
The Red King, yeah, Rufus, the Red King. It was a nickname that William II had. And if you spend time in the Valley of Fear reading about Burlstone, the village and the house itself, I think we get a glimpse into Conan Doyle's proclivity for English history. And we see a number of English monarchs mentioned in this very chapter. So along with William, who else do we stumble across here in the Valley of Fear?
Valley of Fear. Well, you'll encounter James I because there is something referred to in Valley of Fear as being built in the reign of James I, but I don't remember what the reference is.
Yeah, well, it was, the manor house, that part of the building dated back to the time of the First Crusade when Hugo de Capu built a fortalice in the center of the estate, which had been granted to him by the Red King, the aforementioned William II. This was destroyed by fire in 1543, and some of its smoke-blackened cornerstones were used when, in Jacobean times, a British country house rose upon the ruins of the feudal castle. So that would be James I.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and then we have Charles I, and
yes,
that's rather easy to locate in the canon of Sherlock Holmes because, of course, the Musgrave Ritual is so focused on the protection of the lost crown of the Stuarts and the hiding of that over the years. And of course Charles I was deposed as monarch and assassinated, and it's Charles I who is the he and he who is gone.
That's right, which leads us directly to Charles II. How do we know Charles II makes an appearance in the canon?
Well, that's the same case because the reference here in the ritual is he who will come.
Well done. Well, a nice 1-2 punch there. We should also mention that Charles I makes an appearance again in the Valley of Fear. Holmes is schooling Inspector MacDonald. He says, when I tell you that there's some account of the taking of the place by a parliamentary colonel in 1644 of the concealment of Charles for several days in the course of the Civil War, and finally of a visit there by the second George. Well, I just gave away the game. There's our other one.
The second George.
How do you like that? Surprised myself. So we've got George II and Charles I in one sentence there. That's impressive.
Yeah.
But I think Charles also made an appearance in A Study in Scarlet.
Study in Scarlet.
Where was that?
I don't know where it was, but the reference is, his head being struck off.
Yes. Let's see. American Telegram. It's 8 o'clock. Now, yes, he'll probably be here in a few minutes. Open the door slightly. That'll do. Now, put the key on the inside. Thank you. This is a queer old book I picked up at a stall yesterday. De Jure Intergentes, published in Latin at Liege in the Lowlands in 1642. Charles's head was still firm on his shoulders when this little brown-backed volume was struck off. So this was from the library of William White. That particular book that Holmes had. This was in chapter 5. An advertisement. Our advertisement brings a visitor in a study in Scarlet. Well, I suppose before we go through the entire monarchy, Bert, we should take a quick break and then come back and wrap up our list.
When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today.
All right, Bert, by my count, we have 3 monarchs left.
Oh, really? I've got one I can actually add to that, I think.
Oh, good.
But yes, we do. So, yeah, where would you like to begin?
Well, we mentioned Edward in passing before, but we didn't nail down exactly what or where we might find a reference to Edward in the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Oh, right. Well, that's now that is, I must say, until we'd been working on doing the research around this, I had not tumbled to this at all. But apparently, in the Sussex Vampire, the sucking of the poison from his arm. This apparently turns up as a reference in Sussex Vampire.
Yeah, Holmes says, did it not occur to you that a bleeding wound may be sucked for some other purpose than to draw the blood from it? Was there not a queen in English history who sucked such a wound to draw poison from it? So I think that is a reference to Edward I having poison sucked from his arm by the queen.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And I think I'm wrong. I don't think Edward I was Edward the Confessor. I think that was a different Edward.
I don't know. I think you
have to look that
yeah,
up.
you may be right. But that was Queen Eleanor. And there's a famous painting by Angelica Kaufmann from 1780 or so. I think it's in the Wellcome collection, which you can see if you are in London. Wonderful museum there of the Wellcome collection. So yeah, that is a very, very offhanded way to refer to Edward I. The king wasn't even mentioned. It was just the queen that was mentioned in that case. So, but technically, I guess we could say both monarchs. So really, that ups our list to 12. And then another one where it isn't the king by name, but it is the king by virtue of his influence, or at least his era of architecture. This is, of course, Georgian architecture, mentioned in the Three Garadebs, I believe. there were Georgian buildings that Holmes mentioned.
Oh, that's interesting.
Let's see, early Georgian edifice, which was the house where Mr. Garadeb lived.
But wouldn't that? Which George was that, though? Wasn't that
Well,
George III?
technically, it could have been any of the Georges. It says the particular house which we were directed was large, old-fashioned, early Georgian edifice. So, could be George I, could be George III in an early part of his reign. It was hard to say.
Plenty of Georges.
That is by George.
By George.
And there's an idea for a future episode by George. Because I think there are a number of Georges in the canon. Well, stay tuned to get a by George episode at some point. And that leaves us with Queen Anne.
Yes, in The Illustrious Client, the mention of Queen Anne Street, and of course we hear about Queen Anne houses in the Reigate Squires and in the Three Garadebs.
Yes. Yeah, that was. They were wondering whether the house was Queen Anne or Georgian. Yes, and a lovely old Queen Anne house again in the Reigate Squires. Queen Anne Street. And then, before we leave, there's another George who, again, isn't referred to by name because of a particular street. What would that street be?
That was news to me. That was Regent Street. I didn't realize that Regent Street and Regent Circus, which of course is mentioned in the canon, referred to George IV.
Yeah, because he was Prince Regent for quite a while, and really his life was much of a circus anyway. So,
yeah. But I have an addition to the list that we hadn't talked about. George V.
George V, really?
Yeah. So, do you have any idea in the canon where George V is mentioned?
George V.
It's a real puzzle. It's a good puzzler.
Oh goodness! So he's grandson of Queen Victoria.
Yep.
Son of the Prince of Wales under Queen Victoria, and obviously son of Edward VII when he assumed the throne.
Well done, well done.
Goodness, I don't know.
In his last bow, in the early part of his last bow, where von Bork is talking to his mate, his German counterpart. I don't think it's Baron von Herling, but anyway, he's, just the opening of the story. They're talking about this and that, and they start talking about Altamont, and von Bork says, he's an Irish American. And his friend says, oh, really? And von Bork says, yeah. If you heard him talk, you would not doubt it. Sometimes, I assure you, I can hardly understand him. He seems to have declared war on the king's English as well as on the English king.
Well done. I like that. That's a great spot. So that looks like we are now up to 13 monarchs mentioned in the Sherlock Holmes stories. That is something. Well, Harry, here's an offer for folks. This topic was inspired by Chris Redmond. He actually wrote a piece for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere called British Monarchs in the Sherlock Holmes Stories in 2015. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. But what we will also do is we will put a PDF of a booklet that Chris wrote called A Shoe. What is
I hate the title. We must retitle that file. It's a Sherlockian History of England.
A Sherlockian History of England, yes. And this is a 20-something page PDF. We will make that available for all of our Patreon supporters for free. So if you would like to get a copy of Chris's PDF, simply become a Patreon supporter. And if you'd like a hard copy of Chris's booklet here, he'd be happy to send you a copy, $5 post-paid. Simply drop us a line at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Again, that's trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, and let us know if you would like a Sherlockian Handbook of England by Chris Redmond. Well, I wonder if there are going to be any mentions of King Charles III in the Sherlock Holmes stories, Bert.
Oh, I can predict that there will be in future cases. And you can pick your own time zone about that, or pick your own pastiche. But when that happens, I think it's just going to be a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
No, I don't like it, Holmes. You can keep watch. I'll do the criminal part. This is no time to stick at trifles. Think of the Admiralty. Think of the Cabinet. Think of the exalted person herself who waits for news. We're bound to go. I knew you wouldn't shrink at the last.